I've borne witness to horrors beyond mortal comprehension. My companions and I, seekers of truth hidden in the shadows, have traversed the globe in pursuit of spectral phenomenon. Yet nothing could have prepared us for the eldritch terrors that awaited us on the blood-soaked soil of a long-forgotten American battlefield. Our small band of ghost hunters consisted of 4 souls bound by an insatiable curiosity for the supernatural. There was myself, descended from a long line of Bavarian mystics; Hans Mueller, a skeptical physicist whose rational mind had been shaken by an encounter with a poltergeist in his youth; Greta Werber, an expert on occult history whose family had guarded arcane secrets for generations; and Klaus Bayer, a former priest whose crisis of faith had led him to seek answers in the realm of spirit. We had come to this desolate corner of Virginia at the behest of a local historian who had reported strange occurrences on the site of a Civil War skirmish. Locals spoke in hushed tones of unearthly sounds echoing across the mist-shrouded fields at night, of phantom soldiers seen marching in formation, of an oppressive atmosphere that seemed to seep into one's very bones. As our rented vehicle bounced along the rutted road leading to the site, I felt a growing sense of unease. The lush green countryside seemed to darken with every passing mile, the very air growing thick and oppressive. Hans even rationalized, attempting to lighten the mood with jokes about American ghost stories, but his laughter rang hollow in the unnatural stillness. We arrived at the designated coordinates just as the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the overgrown fields before us. An old, dilapidated farmhouse stood on the edge of the property, its windows dark and foreboding. As we unloaded our equipment, EMF meters, infrared cameras, other tools of the trade, I noticed that Greta had gone very pale. "There's something wrong here," she whispered, her eyes darting nervously across the landscape. "Can't you feel it? It's as if the very ground is hungry." Klaus laid a comforting hand on her shoulder, but I could see the concern etched on his weathered face. "We've faced dark forces before, mein Freund. Whatever lurks here, we shall face it together." As twilight deepened into true night, we began our investigation. Hans and Greta took readings near the old farmhouse, while Klaus and I ventured into the field proper. The tall grass whispered against our legs as we moved, and more than once I could have sworn I heard muffled sounds of gunfire. "It's just the wind," I muttered to myself, though the air was eerie still, or perhaps some local teens playing pranks. Klaus shook his head grimly. "This is no prank, Wilhelm. There's an awareness here. Can't you sense it? It's as if 1,000 eyes are watching our every move." I was about to respond when my foot struck something solid in the grass. Kneeling down, I brushed away the vegetation to reveal a rusted piece of metal. As I lifted it, my blood ran cold. It was a belt buckle, corroded by time, but still bearing the unmistakable insignia of a Confederate soldier. "Klaus," I called, my voice trembling, "I think we've found—" My words were cut short by a piercing scream from the direction of the farmhouse. We sprinted back, our hearts pounding, to find Hans supporting a shaking Greta, her face ashen, her eyes wide with terror. "The basement! I saw! God, I saw!" Before she could finish, a low, rumbling sound began to emanate from beneath our feet. The ground itself seemed to tremble, and a foul, rotten stench filled the air. From the shadowy doorway of the farmhouse, a sickly green light began to pulse, growing brighter with each passing second. "We need to leave," Hans said urgently, already beginning to guide Greta towards the vehicle. "Whatever this is, it's beyond our expertise. We need to call in reinforcements. Maybe even—" His words were drowned out by a deafening roar as the green light exploded outward, engulfing us all in a sticky glow. I felt a sensation of falling, being pulled downward by unseen hands, and then darkness, absolute and all-encompassing. When I regained consciousness, I found myself lying face down in cold, damp earth. The air was thick with the metallic scent of blood and the acrid tang of gunpowder. Slowly, I raised my head, blinking to clear my vision. What I saw defied all rational explanation. Gone was the overgrown field and the dilapidated farmhouse. Instead, I found myself in the midst of a raging battle. Union and Confederate soldiers clashed all around me, their uniforms pristine, their faces set in grim determination. Yet, there was something profoundly wrong with the scene. The soldiers moved with an unnatural fluidity, their forms seeming to shimmer and distort at the edges. Their eyes, dear God, their eyes were empty, black voids that seemed to draw in all light. I scrambled to my feet, desperately searching for my companions. "Hans! Greta! Klaus!" I shouted, my voice lost in the cacophony of battle. Just as I turned, I realized with mounting horror that the fighting seemed to be focused on a central point, a swirling vortex of that same sickly green energy we had seen in the farmhouse. And at its edge stood a figure that I could only describe as an abomination. It towered over the phantom soldiers, its form a writhing mass of tentacles and eyes, constantly shifting and reforming. Where its head should have been, a pulsing orb of that verdant light throbbed in time with the vortex. As I watched, paralyzed with terror, I saw it reach out with its pseudopod and grasp one of the spectral combatants. The soldier's form seemed to dissolve, drawn into the creature as it let out a sound that was part scream and part laugh. "Wilhelm!" A hand grasped my shoulder, and I whirled to find Klaus standing behind me, his face pale but determined. "We have to find the others and get out of here." I nodded numbly, allowing him to guide me through the chaos of the battlefield. The phantom soldiers paid us no heed, locked in their eternal struggle as we moved. I began to notice other anomalies, patches of the modern world bleeding through the Civil War tableau. Here, a cluster of our scientific instruments lay scattered in the mud. There, a piece of the old farmhouse wall stood incongruously amidst a grove of trees that looked centuries old. "What's happening?" I shouted to Klaus, as we ducked to avoid a volley of musket fire that passed harmlessly through our bodies. "Have we gone mad?" "I fear it's worse than that. I believe we've stumbled into a tear in the fabric of reality. This place, it's a nexus point where multiple timelines are converging. That thing at the center, it's feeding on chaos, growing stronger with each soul it consumes." Before I could process this terrifying information, we heard a familiar voice calling out, "Over here, quickly!" We turned to see Hans waving frantically from the shelter of a crumbling stone wall. As we approached, I saw Greta huddled beside him, her eyes wide and unfocused. "She's in shock," he explained, as we crouched beside him. "I found her wandering in a daze near that thing. Wilhelm, Klaus, what is happening? In God's name, what is going on?" I opened my mouth to respond, but the words died in my throat as I saw the expression of abject horror that dawned on Hans's face. Following his gaze, I turned to see the battlefield had fallen silent. The phantom soldiers stood motionless, their empty eyes all turned in our direction. Beyond them, towering and terrible, was the abomination. He began to move towards us. Each step it took seemed to distort the very air around us. Reality rippled and warped, images from different eras bleeding into one another. I saw glimpses of the field as it must have looked during the Civil War, flashes of the overgrown present that we had just encountered, and terrifying visions of a blasted, lifeless future. "We have to do something," Klaus said, his voice steady despite the fear that he must be feeling. "We can't let that thing break through to our world." Greta stirred then, her eyes focusing for the first time since we'd found her. "The vortex. It's a wound in time. If we can close it..." Hans shook his head. "With what? We're not equipped to deal with anything like this." As the others argued, I found my gaze drawn to the belt buckle I had discovered. It still lay clutched in my hand, forgotten in the chaos. As I stared at it, a wild, desperate idea began to form. "Our equipment," I said suddenly, cutting through the debate. "Hans, you said it was scattered across the battlefield, yes? If we can gather it, maybe we can use it to disrupt the energy field surrounding that thing." Klaus caught on immediately. "Yes, and if we can weaken it, perhaps we can push it through the vortex before it fully manifests in our reality." It was a long shot, but it was the only plan we had. As the abomination drew ever closer, we split up to gather what we could from our ghost hunting gear. I found myself sprinting across the nightmare landscape, snatching up EMF meters and infrared cameras as I went. All around me, the phantom soldiers began to stir once again, their movements growing more frenzied and erratic. As I ran, I felt a strange doubling of my vision. One moment I was dodging musket fire and cannon blasts. The next I was stumbling through overgrown weeds in the present day. The two realities seemed to be combining, fighting for dominance, and through it all that sickly green light pulsed stronger and stronger. I reunited with the others at the edge of the vortex, our arms full of equipment. The abomination loomed before us, its countless eyes fixed upon our small group with malevolent intelligence. "Now what?" Hans shouted over the rising wind that whipped around us. "We've got to overload it," Greta called back, her earlier shock seemingly forgotten. "Turn everything on at once. Push it to the limit." As one, we activated each piece of equipment we had. The air filled with the shriek of feedback and the whine of overtaxed electronics. The abomination recoiled, its form rippling and distorting even more violently than before. But it wasn't enough. Even as we poured every ounce of energy we could into the makeshift weapon, I could see the creature beginning to push back. The vortex was widening, the boundaries between worlds growing thinner by the second. In desperation, I pulled out the Confederate belt buckle. "Klaus, you said this place was a nexus of timelines. What if we could use something from the past to stabilize the present?" Understanding dawned in his eyes. Without a word, he snatched the buckle from my hand and hurled it directly into the heart of the vortex. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a sound like reality itself tearing apart, the swirling energies began to collapse. The abomination let out a shriek that threatened to shatter our eardrums, its form beginning to unravel. "It's working," Hans yelled triumphantly. "Keep pushing." We redoubled our efforts, forcing every last bit of power through our equipment. The vortex continued to shrink, dragging the writhing form of the abomination back into whatever hellish dimension it had emerged from. And then, with a final earth-shaking roar, it was gone. The vortex snapped shut, leaving behind nothing but a scorched patch of earth and the lingering scent of ozone. We stood there, panting and shell-shocked, as reality settled back into place around us. The phantom soldiers had vanished, leaving behind only the overgrown field and the dilapidated farmhouse that we had once encountered. Is it over?" Greta asked hesitantly, breaking the stunned silence that had fallen over us. Before any of us could answer, a low and ominous rumble began to emanate from beneath our feet. The ground trembled, and in the distance we could see storm clouds gathering with unnatural speed. "I don't think so," Klaus said grimly. "I fear we've only delayed the inevitable. Whatever that thing was, it's still out there, still trying to break through." Hans nodded in agreement. "We need to warn someone, the authorities, other paranormal researchers, anyone who might be able to help prevent this from happening again." As we gathered our scattered equipment and made our way back to our vehicle, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The weight of unseen eyes seemed to press down on us, and whispers just beyond the edges of our hearing teased at our senses. We had survived our encounter with the unknown, but at what cost? What horrors still awaited us in the battles to come? As we drove away from that accursed place, I knew with grim certainty that our war against the darkness had just begun. The road ahead stretched out before us, leading into an uncertain and terrifying future, but we would face it together, armed with the knowledge we had gained and the unshakable bond forged in the crucible of cosmic horror, for we are ghost hunters, and our hunt continues. As our vehicle sped away from the haunted battlefield, an oppressive silence settled over all of us. Each lost in our own thoughts, we grappled with the cosmic horror that we had witnessed, and the chilling knowledge that our ordeal was far from over. The countryside blurred past the windows. The encroaching darkness seemed to swallow the last vestiges of daylight. It was Greta who finally broke the silence, her voice barely above a whisper. We can't just leave. Whatever that was, that thing, it's still out there. We have a responsibility to stop it." Hans gripped the steering wheel even tighter, his knuckles white. "And how do you propose we do that, Greta? We barely escaped with our lives. We've no equipment to handle something of that magnitude." "No one is," Klaus interjected, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "But Hans is right about one thing. We need to warn others. There are organizations, secret societies that deal with threats like this. I have connections from my time with the clergy." I turned to Klaus, surprised. In all our years of working together, he had never mentioned such connections. "What kind of organization?" I asked. "The kind that operates in the shadows, Wilhelm. The kind that guards humanity against threats most people couldn't even comprehend. I had hoped never to contact them again, but—" He trailed off, his expression grim. As if in response to Klaus's ominous words, a flash of green lightning split the sky, followed by a roll of thunder that seemed to shake the very earth. Hans swerved, nearly sending us off the road. "Mein Gott, it's following us," he said. I cranked my neck to look out the rear window. What I saw chilled me to my core. A wall of roiling storm clouds was rapidly gaining on us, shot through with pulses of that sickly green energy we had come to associate with the abomination. And within those clouds, I could have sworn I saw shapes forming and dissolving, grotesque, writhing forms that defied description. "Hans, I think you'd better drive faster." As Hans pressed down on the accelerator, Greta rummaged through her bag, pulling out a worn, leather-bound tome. "There might be something in here," she said, flipping through the pages with shaking hands. "It's an old family grimoire. I've never fully understood all of it, but there are protection spells, banishing rituals." "Now you tell us about this," Hans snapped, his usual skepticism forgotten in the face of our dire situation. "I didn't think we needed it," Greta shot back. "Most of our investigations have been, well, mundane compared to this. Restless spirits, local legends, nothing like—" She gestured helplessly at the encroaching storm behind us. As Greta continued to search her book, I noticed Klaus had closed his eyes, his lips moving in what appeared to be silent prayer. The words I caught didn't sound like any prayer I'd ever heard, though. They were in a language far older, far stranger. Suddenly, Klaus's eyes snapped open. "There," he said, pointing to a dirt road barely visible in the gathering gloom. "Turn there, Hans." "Are you insane? That leads back towards the woods. We need to go to town, to people." "Trust me," Klaus insisted, his voice carrying an authority I'd never heard before. "That road will take us where we need to go." Perhaps it was the desperation of our situation, or perhaps some part of us recognized the ring of truth in Klaus's words. Whatever the reason, Hans wrenched the wheel, sending us bumping down the narrow dirt track. As we plunged deeper into the forest, the canopy above us grew thicker, blocking out what little light remained. The storm seemed to recede, but the oppressive feeling of being watched, of being hunted, only intensified. After what felt like hours, but could have only been minutes, we emerged into a small clearing. At its center stood a decrepit church, its spires listing dangerously to one side. "Stop here," Klaus commanded, already reaching for the door handle before Hans had fully put on the brakes. We piled out of the vehicle, the silence of the forest pressing in around us. No birds sang, no insects chirped. It was as if all of nature was holding its breath. "Klaus, what is this place?" He didn't answer immediately, instead striding purposefully towards the church's weathered doors. "A sanctuary, or perhaps our only hope." As we approached, I noticed some strange symbols carved into the wood of the door, sigils and runes that seemed to shift and change when viewed at different angles. Klaus placed his hand on the center of the door, murmuring words in that same ancient language he had used earlier. With a groan of protest, the wood and rusted metal swung open. The interior of the church was not what I had expected. Instead of pews and an altar, the vast space was filled with bookshelves, stretching from floor to ceiling. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light that seemed to have no visible source. At the far end, where a crucifix might hang, there was an enormous stained glass window depicting a scene of cosmic chaos, swirling galaxies, eldritch entities, and at the center a blazing eye that seemed to stare directly into my soul. "Welcome to the sanctum of the cosmic sigil," Klaus said, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. Greta gasped, her eyes wide with recognition. "I've heard whispers of this place, a repository of forbidden knowledge, guarded by those who stand watch against the great old ones." Hans, for once, seemed at a loss for words. He wandered to the nearest bookshelf, running his fingers over the spine of an ancient tome. "This is impossible." "I'm afraid it's all too real. And now, my friends, we have a choice to make. We can walk away from this and try to forget what we've seen, or we can take up the mantle of the vigil and stand against the darkness that threatens to consume our world." As if in answer, a tremor ran through the building. The stained glass windows blazed with an inner light, and I could have sworn I saw the great eye blink. "I don't think walking away is an option anymore," I said, surprised by the steadiness of my voice. "Whatever's out there, whatever has awakened, it's not going to stop coming for us, or for anyone else." Greta nodded firmly. "Wilhelm's right. We have a duty to use what we've learned to fight back." We all turned to Hans, the eternal skeptic. He stood silent for a long moment, conflict clear on his face. Then, with a resigned sigh, he nodded. "I suppose if we're going to face cosmic horrors, we might as well do it with the best resources available." Klaus smiled, but it was a grim expression. "Then let us begin. We have much to learn and precious little time." As Klaus led us deeper into the sanctum, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were crossing a threshold from which there was no return. Our lives as simple ghost hunters were over. We were embarking on a new path, one fraught with danger beyond imagining. But as I looked at my companions, Hans the skeptic turned believer, Greta, her family's arcane knowledge finding new purpose, and Klaus, the man of faith who had kept earth-shattering secrets, I felt a glimmer of hope. Whatever horrors awaited us in the vast, uncaring cosmos, we would face them together. The ghost hunters had evolved. No longer mere hunters of ghosts, we were now guardians against forces that threatened the very fabric of reality. Our war against the darkness had truly begun, and the fate of the world hung in the balance. As we delved into the ancient texts and eldritch artifacts of the sanctum, preparing for battle, one thought echoed in my mind. The hunt continues, but the stakes have never been higher. As we immersed ourselves in the arcane knowledge of the sanctum, days blurred into weeks. The outside world seemed to fade away, our existence narrowing to the dusty tomes and eldritch artifacts that surrounded us. Each revelation brought new horrors, but also new understanding. Hans, once the voice of skepticism, now pored over quantum theory texts, alongside grimoires of forbidden magic, muttering about the thin line between science and sorcery. Greta's expertise in occult history found a new depth as she uncovered connections between ancient cults and cosmic entities that spanned millennia. Klaus guided us through the sanctum's secrets, his past as a former priest taking on new significance with each passing day. I found myself drawn to prophecies, cryptic verses and maddening visions that hinted at the greater conflict to come. It was in one such text, a crumbling papyrus written in a language that predated human civilization, that I found our first real lead. Listen to this. When the stars align and the veils grow thin, the hunger that waits beneath the world shall reach forth. Its tendrils shall grasp at the threads of reality, and the tapestry of existence shall begin to unravel. Klaus looked up from the star chart he'd been studying, his face grave. That sounds unsettlingly familiar to what we witnessed. Greta nodded, leafing through her own notes. The alignment. There's a rare celestial event coming up, a convergence of planets that only happen once every 1,000 years. And let me guess, Hans interjected, his voice tinged with grim humor. It's happening soon. 3 days from now, Greta confirmed. A heavy sigh fell from all of us. The entity we had encountered, this hunger that waits beneath the worlds, had only been testing the boundaries of our reality. The true invasion was yet to come. We need to go back, I said, words tasting like ash in my mouth. Back to that battlefield. It's a weak point, a nexus where the barriers between worlds are already strained. Klaus nodded solemnly. Agreed, but we can't go in unprepared like last time. We need to gather allies, weapons, anything that might give us the edge. As if in response to his words, a section of bookshelf swung open, revealing a hidden chamber. Inside, illuminated by an otherworldly glow, was an arsenal unlike anything I had ever seen. Ancient swords inscribed with runes of power, firearms that hummed with barely contained energy, amulets and talismans from a dozen different centuries, all radiating a palpable aura of protection. The Vigil has been preparing for this moment for centuries, Klaus explained as we stared in awe. We are not the first to stand against the darkness, nor will we be the last. But we may be the last line of defense for our world. As we began to arm ourselves, a thought occurred to me. What about the local authorities, the government? Surely they must have noticed something by now. Hans laughed bitterly. Oh, I'm sure they have, but what could they do against something like this? No, it's better they remain ignorant. Mass panic would only make our job harder. Over the next 2 days, we prepared as best we could. Greta worked tirelessly on protection wards and banishing rituals. Hans modified our ghost hunting equipment, infusing it with eldritch energy we scarcely understood. Klaus reached out to his contacts in the Vigil, calling in every favor he could to gather what allies were available on such short notice. I delved deeper into the prophecies, searching for any clues, any weaknesses we could exploit against the cosmic horrors that threatened our world. As the hours and the alignment drew near, we made our way back to Virginia. The countryside seemed unchanged, peaceful enough, but we all felt the wrongness that permeated the air. Reality itself seemed to bend and warp around the old battlefield, like space folding in on itself. We set up our equipment in a rough circle around the spot where the vortex had first appeared. Allies from the Vigil, a motley crew of scholars and warriors and mystics from around the globe, took up positions at key points, ready to lend their strength to whatever ritual we might need to perform. As the planets began to align, the air grew thick with tension. The sickly green light that we had come to dread began to pulse beneath the earth, growing stronger with each passing moment. "Whatever happens," I said to my companions, my voice steady despite the fear coursing through me, "it has been an honor to stand with you." Greta squeezed my hand, her eyes shining with determination. Hans nodded grimly, his customary skepticism replaced by steely resolve. Klaus smiled, a look of peace settling over his features. "We stand now at the threshold, guardians against the darkness, sentinels against the void. Whatever horror may come, we face it together for the sake of all we hold dear." As if in response to his words, the ground began to split open. The vortex of green energy erupted skyward, tearing a hole in the very fabric of reality. Through that hole, we caught our first glimpse of the hunger that waits between worlds. It was vast beyond comprehension, a writhing mass of tentacles and eyes and mouths that seemed to extend infinitely in all directions. As it began to push into our world, I felt my sanity straining at the seams. But we had come prepared this time. As one, we raised our weapons, channeling our energies, and began the ritual that would determine the fate of the world. The battle for reality itself had begun, and we, the ghost hunters, stood as humanity's last desperate hope. The cosmic entity surged forward, its countless appendages lashing in all directions. The air filled with an otherworldly shriek that threatened to shatter our eardrums and break our minds. But we held firm, our protective wards flaring to life as they absorbed the brunt of the assault. Greta's voice rose above the chaos, chanting words of power that seemed to make the air vibrate. Hans directed bursts of modified electromagnetic energy at the creature, causing sections of its vast form to ripple and distort. Klaus stood at the center of our formation, his arms raised, channeling the combined might of the Vigil through ancient artifacts that we had brought from the sanctum. And me, I found myself locked in a mental battle with the entity itself. As our allies fought to contain its physical form, I grappled with its alien consciousness, trying to find some weakness, some way to drive it back. Images flashed through my mind, entire worlds consumed, civilizations rising and falling in the blink of an eye, the cold, uncaring vastness of a universe far longer and more terrifying than we had ever imagined. But among the cosmic horrors, I caught a glimpse of something, a pattern, a rhythm, an underlying structure of reality itself. "A resonance," I shouted. "We need to match its frequency." Understanding dawned on Hans's face. He quickly adjusted our equipment, turning it to the cosmic frequency I had glimpsed in my mental struggle. The air around us began to hum, a counterpart to the maddening shrieks of the entity. As our energies aligned, I felt a surge of power unlike anything I had ever experienced. For a brief, eternal moment, we were connected, not just to each other, but to the very fabric of the universe. Through that connection, we pushed back against the hunger that waits between worlds. The entity recoiled, its vast form beginning to collapse in on itself. The vortex of energy that had torn open reality started to shrink, drawing the cosmic horror back into whatever nightmare realm it had emerged from. Our victory, though, was not without cost. As the last of the entity was pulled back through the closing portal, I saw Klaus crumble, blood trickling from his nose and ears, the strain of channeling so much power taking its toll. "Klaus!" Greta cried out, rushing to support him. He smiled weakly, his eyes unfocused. "It's done. The barrier is sealed, but not forever. It will try again." As Klaus slumped into Greta's arms, the last of the otherworldly energy dissipated. The battlefield fell silent, the only sound our ragged breathing and the faint moans of the wounded. We had won, for now. The immediate threat was contained, but as I looked at my exhausted companions, at the allies who had fought beside us, I knew that our war was far from over. The hunger that waits between worlds had been driven back, but not destroyed. And there were other threats out there, other cosmic horrors waiting for their chance to break through reality. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, I made a silent vow. We would recover, we would learn, and we would grow stronger, for we were no longer simple ghost hunters, tracking down local legends and restless spirits. We had become something more, guardians of reality, sentinels against the darkness that lurked between the stars. And our hunt, our endless vigil would continue, for the sake of our worlds and all worlds that might exist beyond our understanding. We would stand ready, always watching, always fighting, always hunting the horrors that lurked just beyond the veil of our fragile reality. The sun rose on a world that had no idea how close it had come to annihilation, and in the growing light we began to plan our next move in a war that might never truly end. In the days that followed our confrontation, the true cost of our victory became painfully clear. Klaus, weakened by the immense energy of the channeling, slipped away peacefully in his sleep. His sacrifice had sealed the breach, but at the ultimate price. We weren't the only ones to suffer losses. Many of our allies from the Vigil fell in battle, their names to be honored in the secret annals of our organization. Greta, overcome with grief at the horrors that she had witnessed, chose to sequester herself in a remote monastery, seeking solace in ancient texts and meditation. Hans, ever the scientist, threw himself into studying the artifacts and knowledge that we had gathered, but the strain proved too much for such a rational mind. I received word that he had been institutionalized, his brilliant intellect shattered by truths that no human was meant to comprehend. As for me, I couldn't simply walk away. The things I had seen, the knowledge I now possessed, they were burdens, but also a responsibility. I took up Klaus's mantle, working to rebuild the Vigil, to prepare for future incursions. Years passed. The world spun on, blissfully unaware of the sacrifice made to keep it safe. I grew older, wearier, but never let my guard down, for I knew the truth. Our victories had been temporary. The cosmic horrors were patient, eternal. They could afford to wait. On the 10th anniversary of our battle, I returned to that Virginia field. The scars of our conflict had long since faded, nature reclaiming the land. As I stood there, remembering fallen friends and the weight of secrets, I felt a familiar tremor in the air. A faint green glow began to emanate from the ground, pulsing like a distant heartbeat. The hunger that waits beneath the worlds had not forgotten us. It was testing the barrier once again, probing for weakness. I sighed, feeling the weight of years and knowledge pressing down upon me. This was to be my life now, an eternal vigilance against threats beyond imagination. As I reached for my phone to alert the vigil, I allowed myself a grim smile. The hunt, it seemed, would never truly end, but as long as I drew breath, as long as there were those willing to stand against the darkness, humanity would have a fighting chance. Perhaps, in the great cosmic scheme of things, that was victory enough. With one last look at the peaceful fields that belied its true nature, I turned and walked away. There was work to be done, preparation to be made, for the next battle in our secret endless war loomed on the horizon, and I would be ready. You're still here. Thanks so much for joining us for tonight's spooky tale. If you'd like a little bit more spooky in your life, why not click on one of the videos that appears at the end of our story, or maybe head on over to one of our playlists where you can get your fill of spooky content. If you like your spooky a little more tactile, I've got a new book that's come out. If you'd like your own copy, there's a link below in the description where you can get your own copy of my spooky book. If you like what you see here on the channel and think you might like to support in a more monetized way, then why not come over to Patreon or become a member on YouTube? Speaking of, let's go ahead and thank our members now. Thanks to Civ Garstad, Unicorn Hollow, and Army Dude for being our spooky ghost contributors. Thanks to Janet, Lee Kendall, Saikat, Ronda J, Sue Casper, and Valinator for being our spooky skeleton contributors. And thanks to Oh Snap, Hi Stacy, Winter, Xaronan, Stephanie Carrington, Tyler Parker, Cinnamon Fox, Grim Reaper, TomBoiTopUwU, and Queen Sheebah for being our ghostly reader tier contributors. And a big thanks to Scott Donahue for being our ghostly writer tier contributor. Thanks everyone, we just couldn't do the show without you. If you'd like to support the channel, then come on down to Patreon, or become a member on YouTube. Spooky Skeleton tier contributors, that's our $5 tier, get their spooky 12 hours early, at 8:30 a.m. as opposed to 8:30 p.m., my time, of course. And while Ghostly Reading is only a tier that's available on Patreon, you get a signed copy of my book anytime I write one on your doorstep in, hopefully, a timely manner. If you'd like a book, we have many on Amazon. I've got links below if you'd like to follow those. Should get you to my page so you can buy any one of my 8 books I believe we're up to now. I'm sure they'd look really nice on your shelf, and I'll sign them for you if you can find me out in the wild. And as always, thanks for stopping by. Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.